Hello, my name is Michael Tesoro and I prepared this video note entitled Epic Games Down by FTC Double Pump. So there's a use of a couple of Fortnite terminologies, downed and double pump, and I'll be discussing a couple of cases which Epic Games has settled with the US Federal Trade Commission, which raised some very serious concerns about the way the company's been operating. Bit of background about myself. I'm a competition and consumer lawyer and I've been running my own practice to Saylor Legal Consulting for the last 15 years and I help companies with competition and consumer law matters. Prior to that I worked at the ACCC for 15 years in a variety of roles including as Director of Enforcement. Now the outlines of the presentation will be pretty straightforward. I'll look at the background facts, look at the decision, which is effectively a settlement but it's going to be approved by the courts, and the implications of the settlements. Now, the background to the case is the FTC, which is a bit like the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission in the US. It looks at consumer matters. It secured a settlement requiring Epic Games, which is the manufacturer and the creator of the Fortnite game, to pay a total amount of $520 million US for privacy and dark pattern breaches. And the first series of penalties, $275 million, related to breaches of the COPPA Act, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And the second amount of money, $245 million, was paid as compensation, or will be paid as compensation to users of the Fortnite game in relation to Epic having deployed design tricks known as dark patterns to dupe millions of players into making unintentional purchases. And this was all done by consent. So Epic Games did not dispute the matter, although it did not admit the contraventions. Now, as I said, the COPPA Act is the subject of the first settlement, and it was introduced in 1998. And the purpose of the legislation was to protect the safety and privacy of children online by prohibiting the unauthorized or unnecessary collection of children's personal information by online operators. And breaches of the COPPA Act constitute breaches of the Federal Trade Commission Act. And there were also separate standalone breaches of the Federal Trade Commission Act Section 5, which prohibits unfair methods of competition. There's actually quite a lot of contraventions in the various complaints. Now, the background to the COPPA breaches is that prior to September 2019 in the US, Epic Games did not require a user to provide their birth date. All they needed to do to set up an account was their first name, last name, email address, and a display name. So there was no birth date required. So there was no way for Epic Games to know the ages of the players of the game. The birth date information was required in the US from September 2019 and in the UK and Europe from 2021. So the game was introduced in 2017, so that's quite a few years before introducing that requirement. And the game allowed various social features which allowed players to find and friend other people, to play matches against other people, exchange personal information, and converse with other in real time by voice and text. So this is a concern where you've got children below the age of 13 potentially interacting with adults on game platforms unsupervised. Now, the first issue that the FTC had to prove was the game was directed to children, defined as people under the age, or children under the age of 13. And they firstly focused on the nature of the game. It's a shooter survival style game, which is based on build and create mechanics, which is very popular with younger kids. I guess the classic build and create game is Minecraft. And it had other features which appeal to young children: cartoony graphics and colourful animation. And as you can see there's a picture of the Battle Royale page, and as you can see, it's very cartoony, the graphics, and very colourful. Then they looked at when the game was released in 2017, and the way they described it was that the soul of Fortnite derives from the common childhood experience of fort building, whether it was blankets and couch cushions or building a fort in the woods by your house. So they're harking back to that childhood experience, which obviously you're looking at young children, probably below the age of 13, engaging in that sort of conduct. Also, their internal documents supported the view that they were really focusing on children under 13. So you've got that first quote: agree with the idea that generally all theming should be relevant to the 8 to 14-year-old markets effectively, and we're not adults. Experience must allow for parental comfort for ages 10 plus. Then they also looked at the merchandising agreements which Epic Games had entered into with various companies, and a lot of them were toy companies or companies that wanted to release merchandising that was aimed at the child market. So here's just an example from the complaint of a Walmart toy catalogue with all the Fortnite branded products there on the left, and you can see they're really directed to younger children. Then they looked at the statistics, and there was a survey put out in 2019 which showed that 53% of all US children aged between 10 and 12 played Fortnite weekly, which is a remarkable amount of people playing. That's 53% of all US children in that age group. And then you can see it dropping down between 13 and 17, the participation rate dropped to 33%, and then between 18 to 24, it dropped to 19%. That's clearly very focused on that younger market, 10 to 12-year-old players. And there were a lot of internal communications in Epic that reported that the Epic Games staff had been inundated with questions and requests during in-person conversations with players under 13, and so they're obviously getting evidence from their inquiries and complaints that a lot of the children playing are under the age of 13. So the FTC's concerns were that Epic was matching children and teens with strangers and adults in interactive gameplay, and that's unsupervised obviously, publicly broadcasting players' display names, so breach of privacy obligations, and also imposing real-time communications through on-by-default voice and text chat. So by default, you would talk to other players either by voice or text. So these direct interactions between young children and other people, strangers they didn't know, and that was obviously problematic. Now, there were a lot of concerns about what had actually occurred. Obviously, broadcasting players' account names and imposing live on-by-default voice and text communications had resulted in substantial harm. And they identify some of the harm, identified children have been bullied, threatened, harassed, including sexual harassment, and children had been exposed to dangerous and psychologically traumatizing events, including suicide and self-harm. And there were further reports of predators blackmailing, extorting or coercing children and teens they met through Fortnite into sharing explicit images or meeting offline for sexual activity. So this is exactly the conduct which COP is seeking to prevent, preventing young children being exposed to adults who they don't know and for things like this to occur. So the FTC was concerned also that Fortnite was aware of these problems and did nothing to make significant changes. So they're aware of the basic toxicity prevention mechanisms, including just changing the voice chat options to be opt-in at the very least, in actual fact to maybe disable it entirely. But these concerns expressed internally were to no avail. And there was an example not too long after the product was released of a high-profile gamer verbally harassing a young player while publicly streaming it to an audience of thousands of viewers. And the response from the Epic Games employee was, "We honestly should have seen this coming, or at least expected this with an on-by-default voice chat system. Situations like this are bound to happen." So you have an awareness from as early as October 2017 on the internal documents that there are problems with this, but no action is taken. Eventually they did introduce an age gate, but I think it's a self-declared age gate, so it's not very fail-safe or foolproof, and that was only introduced in America in 2019. And the FTC describes these particular changes as dilatory changes, much too little too late. So the breaches identified in the complaint are that the Epic Games failed to provide notice about what information it collected, how it was going to use that information, and disclosure practices. Also failed to provide notice to parents about the information collected from children, failing to obtain consent from parents before the collection of personal information, also failing to provide a means of reviewing the personal information collected, and finally failing to delete personal information on request that had been collected from children. Now, the remedies that were agreed to was 275 million US in monetary penalty for violating the copper rule, also requiring Epic Games to adopt a strong privacy default settings and ensuring that voice and text communications are turned off by default, so you actually have to actively turn them on, and obviously a permanent injunction to try and prevent future violations of the Act and the rule. Now, moving to the dark patterns breaches, the FTC alleged here that their breaches of the Federal Trade Commission Act Section 5, unfair methods of competition, by using dark patterns to trick players into making unwanted purchases and letting children rack up unauthorised charges without parental approval. Now, the first issue that the FTC explains is that Epic saved consumers payment information by default and used it to bill consumers for future charges, and many users were unaware that this information had actually been saved. Also, the way they showed things led consumers not to being fully aware of certain issues. So here you've got the game page, and as you can see, it's got certain information on that page, but below that appearing page there's further relevant information, but the only way to get to it is to scroll down, which is a very unlikely thing for a person who wants to play this game to do. But when you actually scroll down, you discover that there's the game age rating information, and that's below the fold. So what they mean is below the page people can see. It requires scrolling down to find it. And there was a small white box below that page you just saw, which contained the game's age rating, and also very small and tiny font text stating in-game purchases users interact. So all that information is effectively hidden from users. Then there's the use of V-Bucks, and that's the currency you have to use to buy things in game on Fortnite. And it was apparent that kids could just buy V-Bucks by just pressing the button. There was no need for any parental approval, cardholder approval or consent. You didn't have to enter a PIN number, a password, or authorize the purchase, or even to enable such a control. So basically, it was very easy to purchase things with one click. And this was in the context of previous actions by the FTC against other large providers where they've been in trouble for the same thing. So actions were taken against Amazon, Apple and Google around 2014. So that Epic Games really should have been on notice about the problems with the way they were doing things. Here's some examples of the types of complaints that Epic were getting. This is what from parents. Hello Epic Games, the charges associated with this account were made without my authorization. This account is associated with my 10-year-old son's account, and I'm really disappointed that there is no check and balances that alerted me of these charges, and a 10-year-old can purchase coins worth almost $500 so easily. And the second example, Epic Games is swindling parents with authorized games purchases, tricking young consumers and using shady practices for billing. I authorize a one-time Epic Games purchase for my 11-year-old son, only to discover EG did not erase my credit card info, and thus my son has been making unauthorized purchases, racking up $140 in less than 8 days after the initial authorized purchase. So these are the types of complaints that Epic Games are getting regularly, but they seem to be taking no notice of them. So the concerns the FTC had about Epic Games' conduct were that they'd included very small and hard to find checkboxes which allowed parents to make a one-time payment. So that wasn't clearly apparent to parents. There was a one-click payment. There was no second step required to confirm the purchase, which is very unusual. You usually have to confirm the purchase with a second click, or you're asked whether you're sure about the purchase, but really the kid could do it with simply one purchase, one click of the button. There was also no requirement for the parent to enter a credit card or CCV number, which is again very unusual. And the location of the purchase button on the game controllers was in such a place that it created risk of mistake. So effectively the button that you would use to sort of cancel or to make a purchase was also used for other in-game actions. So often you'd have situations where a player would be playing the game, press the button and inadvertently make a purchase. So the other very relevant factor is that this wasn't a small issue. They reckon that Epic had received more than 1 million complaints for consumers related to such unwanted charges. And in the relevant period, they made approximately $4 billion US on these in-game purchases, which the FTC claimed a lot of those were unwanted charges. Now, another very concerning element of this case is the way that the executives of Epic seem to be aware of the problem but didn't take any action. So here you have a concern raised by an employee where he says it's a bit of a dark user experience pattern to not have confirmation on once you hit the refund limit. So he's commenting that really it's a dark pattern. What they've got on their program is a dark pattern. And then there's an observation there that Epic feared that by adding a confirmation button, so a second step, would add friction, resulting in a decent number of people second guessing their purchase. So by providing more information, they'd reduce the number of impulse purchases and thus reduce their revenue. So here's the screen, and as you can see there's a button there saying undo your purchase. And they actually changed that button to make it less clear as to what functions were available there. So here's the page after they made the changes. As you can see, the undo button is totally gone, and they've actually moved the undo function to below the character. There you see the character standing on the disk, and under there is where they actually effectively moved the undo function, and you can hardly read that given the background. So as noted by the FTC, Epic changed the name of the button to cancel purchase from undo, reduced the size of the button, moved it to the bottom of the screen, and then required consumers to push and hold the button on their controller to activate the cancel purchase function. And not to mention the fact that it's actually on a blue background and very hard to read. And they also noticed in internal documents that after making these particular changes to that page, Epic observed a 35% decline in the net undo rate. So effectively what happened, because by making the button harder to find, 35% of people who previously would have undone their transaction didn't, which equates to a 35% increase in revenue for those purchases. Now, another really concerning aspect is the fact that the organization was aware of these problems and accepted them. So here there's an observation from the complaint that Epic deliberately required consumers to find and navigate a difficult and lengthy path to request a refund. So when a parent was concerned about these unauthorized purchases, they could try to get a refund from Epic, but the process for getting refunds was made very, very difficult. And they hid the link to submit the refund request in the settings tab, and they also removed it from the purchase screen, even though that's where somebody would make a purchase. And there's this very damaging quote from the complaint. The Epic user experience designer helped design the refund request path reported that he put the link there in an attempt to obfuscate the existence of the feature, and not a single player found this option in the most recent round of user experience testing. So they actually devised a dark pattern, implemented the dark pattern, and then tested how effective it was, and it's obviously very effective in preventing people from seeking refunds. And then when the designer was asked whether he should make the feature easy to find, he was told by a superior it is perfect where it is at. So that shows a very cynical approach to the whole process of providing refunds, which does go to the management level of Epic Games. So as a consequence of all these breaches, they were required to pay $245 million US into a fund to pay consumer redress to various users. The question is whether that's enough money really, because given they had $4 billion US of sales and a large number of those purchases were unwanted purchases, it doesn't sound like $245 million is going to be enough to pay consumer redress. Now, a bit of commentary about the case. Firstly, it's a very poor conduct. It's very concerning reading the complaint, just how Epic Games approached a lot of the issues, and they're actually designing dark patterns to confuse and mislead their customers to paying more. And in many cases, it's allowing children to just rack up big debts, and they're not facilitating refunds to parents. Clearly, they have very poor to non-existent compliance processes. It's quite remarkable for such a big company that's been around for a while not to have better compliance processes. It seemed like junior staff were continually reporting concerns to senior management and nothing was happening, or there was active refusal to make any changes. So this is a big concern. Hopefully that's improved in the organisation. Clearly this conduct caused significant harm, not only financial harm, but a lot of damage to young children through the copper breaches. There was a lot of bullying, threatening, sexual harassment, and that's really entirely unacceptable. And in the context of what happened under the copper breaches, it's really questionable whether a $275 million US penalty is high enough. It does also provide a really good insight into the way dark patterns are being used by companies to steer consumers into directions they don't want to go, or to make it much more difficult to really buy things with full information as to what you're buying. So dark patterns not only exist, but they're actively being used by digital platforms to generate additional revenue. The last question is whether laws are able to deal with dark patterns. Obviously, the Section 5 of the FTC Act, Unfair Methods of Competition, is a very broad instrument which allows the FTC to take actions against this. It's a real question mark whether the Australian consumer law, the Consumer Protection Act in Australia, would be effective in taking action against this conduct. I think probably not. I think this is a good case to add strength to the argument that the ACCC needs more powers to battle dark patterns, because a lot of this conduct would have been very difficult to pursue under the Australian consumer law. Alleging misleading conduct by silence would have been difficult. So I think this strengthens the ACCC's case for some new powers. So that's all I had. If you have any questions about this particular presentation, feel free to give me a call or send me an email. Bye-bye.